I think we can get started. The room is nicely packed. It's very nice to see all of you here tonight at the first event of the Center for Digital Culture in this academic year. My name is Paolo Gerbaudo, and I'm the current director of the Center for Digital Culture here at King's College. The Center for Digital Culture is a research center that has been formed last year and whose mission is to look at digital technology and its social, cultural, and political effects. At how the digital transformation of society, which is in front of our eyes in so many different sectors of society, in so many different domains of society, what is its meaning and what are its political, ethical, and social implications. We've been running a number of conferences and talks in previous years, and this is the first event this year and the first of a number of events that will look at very different issues having to do with politics, everyday life. This year, our annual conference is on the digital everyday, the digital transformation of everyday life. So if you're interested in these kind of events, stay tuned. We have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter, we don't have a Snapchat yet, but we will do that to attract children in the future. We have a lot of stuff that you may be interested in. All right, so this event today is about a very hot topic, a topic that concerns some very important elements in the way in which the economy, society, and politics operate. That is the digital transformation of the economic system. The title is The Gig Economy and the Automation Revolution. These are two trends that we are witnessing in the contemporary economic system. I mean, the gig economy is a term that has been often used in tandem with a more rosy term, the sharing economy, to talk about the effects of companies as Deliveroo, Uber, AirBnB, and many others, and the way in which they introduce new forms of economic relationships and economic organization, which revolve around platforms which allow producers and consumers to find each other in the digital market. And the automation revolution is instead a more long-term trend of automation, is sometimes described as a second wave of automation, as different aspects of the economy are becoming automated. I mean, usually the things we associate with automation revolution are robots, but actually the robots are only a part of the equation. Self-driving cars are only a part of the equation. We already see automation in the way in which, for example, the platforms of Deliveroo and Uber operate, and the way in which workers are coordinated not by a boss, by a manager in flesh and bones, but by algorithms. There was a very interesting Financial Times article titled significantly, "My Boss is an Algorithm." I don't know if it is better to have an algorithmic boss rather than one in flesh and bones, but definitely it's quite a Halloween-style spooky prospect to have an algorithmic boss. So tonight we approach this topic looking at both the positives and negatives, say, of what can be described as a new field of social and economic organization, and also as a new field of struggle. We know that there is a lot of controversy around companies as Uber, and Deliveroo, and many other companies. There have already been protests and mobilizations against these companies, and there are also attempts to construct new alternative forms of economic organization. For example, in the US in particular, there is a lot of debate about platform cooperativism. There is the idea that we can substitute capitalist platform companies with cooperative companies owned by their users and their producers, and not bound to the kind of profit motive that is instead so evident in all these giants as the GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, Airbnb, and Uber, and so on and so forth. And we have a number of questions that we would like to look at. I mean, we know that there is a transformation that is going on, but we want to know what this transformation is going towards. Are we heading towards a world of small digital entrepreneurs, or digital slaves? Are we heading towards a world of ever-growing and ever-pervasive capitalism, or towards a world of platform cooperativism? And what are the new forms of struggle and economic organization that are emerging in this context? We have a number of very excellent speakers that have done a lot of work on these issues from different angles, joining us tonight to look at this aspect. Starting from my left, Mayo Fuster joining us from Barcelona. She came here for a talk today, and she's flying soon, so she will be our first speaker, because she needs to catch a plane. Mayo is an activist and social researcher based at the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya, where she is the director on collaborative economy at the Internet Interdisciplinary Institute founded by Manuel Castells. Her research focuses on social movements, online communities, and digital commons. Zina Feldman is a colleague of mine at the Department of Digital Humanities. She is a lecturer in digital culture. Her research looks at the relationship between online and offline spheres and at questions of around how the communication technologies interface with understandings and performances of traditionally analog concepts. For instance, romance, friendship, conflict, work, self-care, gastronomy, and travel. I particularly like the gastronomy aspect, I have to confess. Then, to my left, Alex Williams is a visiting lecturer in sociology at City University. He is the co-author with Nick Srnicek, yeah? I made it, yeah? Of Inventing the Future, Post-Capitalism and a War Without Work, 2015 Verso release, which looked at the way in which the new strategy of the left in the 21st century, arguing that the left needs to embrace technology rather than reject technology to move towards a post-capitalist future in which humanity may eventually be liberated from work. Then to my right, Phoebe Moore is a senior lecturer in the Department of Law and Politics at Middlesex University. She has conducted extensive research on the transformation of the workplace in digital times. The work she does is quite scary in many respects. I mean, right, the findings, especially the new forms of domination that are now developing in the workplace, how bosses can control more and more employees using badges or a number of tracking devices through which they can see how much they're working, how productive they are. And so we are I'm very eager to hear from her about this. And then finally, Nick, to the extreme right, though he would be to the extreme left in the political spectrum, as most people around this table, as all people around this table, we confess, is a lecturer at City, University of London. He is the co-author of Inventing the Future, and is the author of a forthcoming book published by Polity called Platform Capitalism, a book which explores the common logic of platform companies as Google, Facebook, Apple, and many others, and the new tendencies that are inherent in this business logic of the platform economy. So we have a lot of stuff to discuss, little time to discuss that, and we'll ask. This event is organized as a roundtable, so it will mostly be more of a kind of discussion dialogue, but Mayo will instead have the privilege to deliver a presentation of 10 minutes. Okay. To you, Mayo.
Thank you. Thank you. Is that without microphone?
You should have, there should be a feedback. I think if you speak from over there, they should hear you. There's a microphone up there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Do you hear me well? So thank you, Paolo, for inviting me to give the talk. Thank you, everybody, for coming here. And I'm sorry that I have to leave just after I present because I have to pick up a plane. So I'm going to... Many people get to know about collaborative economy because of the type of or sharing economy with the type of message that has arrived through the mainstream media, putting Uber and Airbnb as collaborative economy or sharing economy. That's not my story. Like, my story started from trying to build collaborative communities through new technologies and end up producing commons. And then it arrived all the Uber and Airbnb afterwards. So I'm going to make the presentation on the basis of how I have been living this development. So I'm going to present about what we call commons collaborative economy in Barcelona. First, to say that in Barcelona we have many experiences of collaborative economy from a commons perspective. We documented 1,340 experiences. So Barcelona is really a place where there is an explosion of this type of activity. And what do we interpret this increase of social collaboration and through the new technologies? We interpret this as a reaction to the economic crisis of 2008. And here I want to recall the work of Manuel Castells, which actually did an analysis of how far in Catalonia we have seen an increase of alternative economical practices since 2008. So he has been looking into ethical banking, for example. If accounts on ethical banking have been increased since the banking crisis, and all of a set of alternative economic practices in the cities has grown since 2008. And collaborative economy is one of the strands of economical innovation happening as a reaction to the crisis. And for us, it's actually, we understand collaborative economy as a possibility of scaling our tradition of social economy. In Barcelona, 10% of the economy are cooperatives. 10% of our GDP are cooperatives. So 10% is not a bad number, but we want to be more, and we see this collaborative economy as a possibility, a channel for actually scaling it up into a larger number. So as I was saying, the evolution of collaborative economy, as I have been experiencing, is that first emerged the model that I call is known as open commons. Here we have the case of the very first case was the free and open source software project, then Wikipedia, which is a community collaborating and taking an encyclopedia, and also the case of Coteo, which is a crowdfunding platform in which if you get funding for your project, you have to give something back to the community with the idea of the commons. So that was the first model to appear. Then appeared the unicorn, Uber and Airbnb. And now we have a third reaction, a third wave of collaborative economy known as platform cooperatives. What is the distinction between these three waves of collaborative economy? First, if we look about the type of economical enterprise, how far is based on democratic economy management, no? So in the case of open commons, like Wikipedia and Coteo, they are based on non-for-profit foundations, but they have a participative governance. For example, Wikipedians can choose the board members of the foundation and also can choose the policies that regulate their own interaction. Same happened with Coteo. This is something you don't find in Airbnb. Airbnb is a corporate. There is not economic democracy behind it. It's as it is. In contrast, platform cooperatives are small and medium enterprises of cooperatives, but they also have a participative governance in behind connected to the cooperative tradition. Second element that distinguishes these three modalities of collaborative economy is the type of technology, which is a very important element for setting the power dimension of the whole process. While Open Commons is based on free and open source software project, which means that we can replicate the means of production. We can actually take the platform, which is the base of the collaboration, and replicate it and do what is known in the field as a fork. If we are unhappy with the platform provided, this is something cannot happen with Airbnb because it's based on proprietary technology. Again, we also see it in platform cooperativism. The third dimension, which distinguishes the three models, is the type of knowledge or the policy of knowledge, while the Open Commons model is based on open data and the use of free licenses, Creative Commons and this kind of licenses. Unicorn modality is based on locked knowledge, and platform cooperatives vary. There is some cases that are also based on open data and open commons, open knowledge, but other cases are not. So when we talk about collaborative economy, I think it's important to see how there has been several waves of modalities in which first it was the open commons, then Silicon Valley came up with Unicon, adopting some of the collaborative dimensions, but getting back the democratic governance and the open knowledge. And now we have a third reaction of transfer cooperativists wanted to connect collaborative economy with cooperatives in order to assure sustainability, and particularly individual sustainability and assuring income for the people who contribute. There is also another difference between the models, which has to do with how they are being funded. The financial system behind them, and this is a very central element. While Wikipedia's Coteo, obviously, is based on crowdfunding and decentralized funding, also the case of Fermondo and the platform cooperativists, behind Airbnb or Trip for Real or Uber, there is international capital financial system. And the case of Uber, for example, there is Goldman Sachs. And this very much determine the evolution of the system. There is a model in which there are startups having a good idea. Venture capital can bring a very large financialization, grow very, very fast, and they dominate the market. And in this way, there is the scalability model. But actually, they are not sustainable. If we think about Uber, actually, Uber is not sustainable in itself. Uber does not have gains. Uber has funding. Uber has venture capital. But by gaining risk, because they wanted to expand. But when the venture capital stopped, Uber collapsed. It's not sustainable in itself in terms of cost and benefits. And I think this is also an element to put into highlights. Also the question of which type of funding you have behind, the international capital behind this system. Another distinction between the models is which type of political system are they reinforcing. And here, while open commons and platform cooperatives, as far as they are based on open data, they facilitate much more the knowing about the level of activity in a city or the impact or the consequences it might have. With Airbnb, we don't know how many houses are in a city, or we might trust the Airbnb, or we don't know how many of the proponents are multi-proprietary or are only given a room, no? And this is very problematic as far as if we cannot know the level of economical activity, which is something, how we are going to know to calculate the taxation of it or being aware of the impact it might have on access to housing as a basic right or other type of dimensions. And connected to this problematic of not releasing data and being very untransparent, the unicorn modality, there is something else. It's very aggressive lobbying strategy. Getting actually Uber contracted many of the lobbyists who came from the pharmaceutical industry in order to lobby particularly the European Commission to regulate in its favor. In June, the European Commission released the European Agenda of Collaborative Economy, and it's very actually get unicorn as the modality of reference. And here we also end up with bad political practices, or even we can call it corruption, when we have cases like, for example, the main responsible of the digital agenda in Europe, after stopping his work, and who was very much a proponent of promoting of the support of Uber, 6 months after quitting his job, goes to work with Uber. The same happened with Barroso. We now know that Barroso is going to go to work for Goldman Sachs, that by coincidence is also the founder of Uber. So here we have a very economical system that brings us a political system that is also very brings us a very problematic situation. Other type of problems, which are not only of the unicorn, is the element of reproducing inequalities in society. There has been a study about how far, if you are not white, you have a 16% less possibilities of getting a room or a place in Airbnb. But here, actually, the Open Commons is not a great example, because if we look into the gender data, free and open source software projects have a 1.5% of women, while the proprietary industry of software has 30% of women, or Wikipedia have only 10% of women. So that this problematic of this modality of collaborative production, not only reproducing but reinforcing inequalities dimensions present in society, is something very, very problematic of all the models, not only of unicorn. But the element that the unicorn modality does not provide the data and is very untransparent makes much more difficult to actually identify the problem and try to put solutions. To provide other examples of Open Commons model in Catalonia, which very much represent the soul of the commons, there is the example of Wifinet. Wifinet started as a collaboration between neighbors in the mountains in the Pyrenees of Catalonia, because the telecoms didn't want to supply internet access in the Pyrenees because it was not affordable. But it was not. You don't make business to make all this infrastructure only for 3 or 4 clients. So they were not providing the internet access, and the municipalities were not neither respecting the right to communicate and have access to the internet. So they were not providing the internet access needed. So in this context, in which neither the administration, neither the market is providing a solution, commons emerge as a collaboration between citizens in order to provide the resource. And today, 2 decades later, Wifinet is the largest and more robust commons wireless infrastructure in the world. Last year, the European Commission gave Wifinet a prize, but not only because of the great technology, because it's a very robust wireless community network, but because its business model. Because Wifinet is based on the commons infrastructure of Wifinet share, but also an ecosystem of small and medium and cooperatives around the territory providing complementary services. The commons theory came from the framework of Eleanor Ostrom, as she's the Nobel Prize winner of 2009. So she proved how far commons as a much more efficient and more democratic system than market or state. Then Yochai Benkler took this kind of framework and applied it to the digital type of commons. More example of open commons modalities in Barcelona. I want to call the child caring. There is a rising of a lot of groups of 10, 20 childs, which their parents organize in order to collaboratively take care of them, provide education, and be very experimental about the pedagogy. And also exchange clothes or exchange toys. Another very, very famous case in Barcelona is the Fab Labs, which now started in Barcelona, but now is in every city, like it's spread a lot. Fab Labs is about collaborative fabrication based on sharing the design of machine and these kind of things. But there are other type of cases that normally are not being mentioned, which I think are important, which are connected to the tradition of social movements. For example, the social centers, the squads, that's also commons, have been collaboratively managed. And here I want also to bring about the case on the housing sector, in which there is the case of PA, which means the platform of those affected by the mortgage. So what happened in Spain is that after the crisis, many people get a big debt connected to buying the house, a very high price. And in Spain, if you cannot pay the mortgage, you lose the house, but still you have to pay the mortgage. And it's a very problematic situation. So citizens started to collaborate in order to fight the situation and get solidarity. So I was helping you for you not being evicted, and you were helping me. And that was very important also for bringing collaboration between immigrants and locals. And so the PA has stopped 2,045 evictions and have relocated 5,000 families. That's collaboration. And the founder of this collaborative economy, a very successful case, is Ada Colau, which is our mayor now. So you can bring, with this I want to point about the political potential of the collaborative economy when experiences like the PA has bring about not only a form of solidarity in a context of very high, very problematic housing problem, but also how far this model has been applied also for organizing a political campaign and gaining a global city like Barcelona. Platform cooperativist models, we also have many in Barcelona. And just to end up, I want to say that one of the platform cooperativist avenue is actually thinking about buying the big corporate cases, like, for example, Twitter. Now, if you have been reading the news, Twitter has lost its value a lot. The price of Twitter is much lower. What about organizing for buying Twitter between the Twitter users? And that's not something, it's not new. Historically, in the internet, that has happened. For example, with Netscape, it was one of the main browsers, was then bought and adopted by Mozilla, which was a foundation. So it's an avenue of evolution of the sector, which I think is also interesting to have present. In Barcelona, we are also connecting collaborative policy with collaborative economy. So we are developing the policy of collaborative economy in a collaborative manner. So that's...
Thanks very much. All right, I'm sorry to cut you short, Mayo. One thing that I forgot to say is that we have an hashtag that you can use, is KCL Digital Culture. KCL Digital Culture. If you want to tweet what we are saying tonight. And, I mean, it was good to start with Mayo's presentation because, I mean, the situation now in Barcelona is very positive, very optimistic, and you need some optimism in these dark ages, right? But now we are turning from paradise to hell and looking at platform capitalism, looking at, I mean, what was very interesting in Mayo's talk was the way in which the collaborative economy started, right, with cooperative principles at their heart, when now what people describe as the collaborative economy or the sharing economy is actually associated with companies as Uber, Deliveroo, and many others that have quite different ethics. And here I'm turning to Nick, who has completed a book that will be published soon on the topic of platform capitalism, the new capitalism of platforms. And what I want to ask you, Nick, for a start is, I mean, what is the new business logic of all these companies? I mean, because we hear a lot about platforms, all of the platform economy, but, I mean, what is actually the shared organizing principle of all these different companies?
So part of my argument in the book is to say that platforms are a unique business model. And they're different from both the sort of Fordist models that we're used to, but also the post-Fordist models as well. So a Fordist model would be something like a factory. They buy, raw materials from a series of companies. They turn them into a product. They then sell it to a consumer. And for most of the point of history, they've never really collected much data on all of this. So they don't know about what the consumers are doing with the goods that they're producing. They're mostly concerned with selling as many goods as possible. Platforms are different. They don't really sell a good. Instead, what they do is they bring groups together. And effectively what they do is what economists will call intermediation, which is basically something like Facebook, for instance. You bring advertisers on the one hand together with users on the other hand. Google would bring advertisers and search users in another case. So these are what platforms do, is they don't sell a product per se. Instead, they bring these groups together. Now, what's interesting about them is that by providing the sort of infrastructure for these groups to come together, they then are in a very prime position to collect all of the data about what these users are doing. So if you're using Uber, Uber can collect all of your data. They can collect all the data on drivers and everything like that. So this means that these platform models are basically the sort of business model that's adequate to a capitalism that's premised upon data. So this is what they're very good at. And this is, I think it's no surprise that we've seen platforms rise in importance over the past 15 years. As data has become more and more important to capitalism, platforms are becoming more and more important. And we see this not just in the tech sector as well. So it's not just Facebook, it's not just Amazon, it's not just Google. Instead, you have companies like GE, Siemens, Monsanto, John Deere, all of these companies which are traditional industrial companies are now adopting platforms into their companies. And this is basically as a way to collect more and more data. And data becomes the sort of comparative advantage against other companies. Now, I think this leads to some problems for the idea of a platform cooperative. One is, well, there's an expansionary logic to these platforms. If data is central to your business model, if the way in which you compete against other platforms is to collect more and more data and either sell it or use it in a more effective way, this competitive logic also holds for platform cooperatives. There's going to be incentives for them to collect more and more data, and the sort of privacy concerns that we're, worried about are continually going to get tossed to the side. The other sort of aspect is the resources that are behind platforms as we know them today. So Uber, for instance, is valued at $65 billion. In China alone, it was losing about $1 billion a year, trying to fight off its other unprofitable competitor within China. Capitalism is supposed to be about profit, but actually these companies are wildly unprofitable. So Uber, how do you compete against Uber when it's losing $1 billion a year and just doesn't care? You can't. A platform cooperative is not going to compete against them. The other aspect, though, is not just the financial hurdles, but also the hurdles of data collection. So the amount of data that Uber has been able to collect means that competing against it with some sort of bottom-up organization is immensely difficult. And finally, the other one is network effects. The fact that we all know Uber, we use Uber, drivers use Uber, and this means that more and more people are drawn into the platform to begin with. The same thing with Facebook. We've seen numerous competitors with Facebook, and they always fail. And it's basically because everybody's already using Facebook, and it's very difficult to draw people into an alternative platform. So for all of these reasons, I think platform cooperatives face immense challenges, at least in areas where there's already a platform being built. So platform capitalism has this sort of dominating monopolistic logic, which I think we need to be very aware of.
I mean, it's quite interesting what Mayo was saying before, and something that you were also saying now in your intervention. The fact that, it's quite interesting the fact that these companies don't make profit at the moment. So how do you explain that? How can that hold in a capitalist system where you are expecting companies to make profit? How does it happen?
So I think it's worth distinguishing between a series of different types of platforms. Google, Facebook are essentially advertising platforms. Google makes 89% of its revenues from advertising. Facebook makes about 96% of its revenues from advertising. So they have a stable source of income, and they can use that to then do their other sort of things, whether it be VR or self-driving cars and all these sort of moonshot projects. Now, that's different from something like Amazon, which is more premised upon e-commerce and increasingly premised upon cloud-based computing. So cloud-based computing is another major source of revenues for a lot of companies nowadays. But Uber, Airbnb, all these things with the sharing economy, they're different. They have a different source of revenue from something like Google, and I think it's worth distinguishing that. Uber and Airbnb are primarily venture capitalist funding. It's welfare from wealthy people within Silicon Valley, which enable these companies to survive. Now, I think what's quite likely to happen is that actually these companies are going to remain unprofitable, they're not going to turn profitable, and eventually that venture capital is going to dry up. You're already starting to see this. The end of 2015, venture capital dropped off quite significantly for a lot of these companies, and it seems to be drying up in 2016 as well. Now, this basically means that all of these companies will no longer have access to financing, and I think there's two options for them. One is to go bankrupt, And I think we'll see a lot of these companies collapse over the next couple of years. The other is to turn into a luxury service, where they basically jack up the prices, and it's rich people who can afford to use these things, and everybody else has to be stuck with less sort of technologically advanced ones. The other alternative, and Uber is an interesting case of this, is basically completely transitioning the business model. So Uber is premised right now upon the hyper-exploitation of workers and the outsourcing of costs, whether it be the maintenance or the legal fees involved in owning a car. That's all outsourced to workers. Increasingly, what they're trying to do, though, is self-driving cars, where you wouldn't need workers whatsoever. And interestingly, with self-driving cars, you could establish a monopoly position over ride-sharing within any particular city. And that's sort of Uber's long-term plan. I think this is why they can get $65 billion worth of valuation, is because people recognize that their long-term plan actually could be quite profitable. Whether or not they'll be able to do that in the long run, we'll see. But for the most part, I think the sharing economy is going to be a momentary blip that we'll all forget about in 5 years.
So in a way, you're saying the platform capitalism is a bubble, sort of bubble.
Absolutely. It's not quite as big as the late 90s bubble, but it is absolutely a bubble which is, going to burst quite soon.
So following on this path through hell, we move to Phoebe. I'm saying that because your research, to me, it really raises the most scary aspects of platform capitalism and of the digital economy, and the way in which a number of devices that are introduced to the workplace allow for new forms of control. Can you tell us a bit about your research on that? In particular, the research you conducted, you finished recently in Rotterdam, where you, if I'm correct, you looked at a company that carried out a year's worth of quantified workplace, digitalizing their workers' body and activities to the max. So what happened to workers? Did they survive the experiment, or?
No, absolutely. And excellent question. To start off with, I'd like to say that the hell that you describe is very interesting, because I think what you're kind of referring to is the kind of affective dimension to the types of possibilities in this whole new world. And I'm looking at the world of work. So I will just kind of refer quickly to a couple of different projects. I've actually made a slide where there are quite a few bits and bobs explaining and just sort of outlining what I've done so far in this area. Should we just put it up just quickly? I think it's very easy to do it, apparently. So I just kind of put the technologically challenged that I am. No, okay. Right. So Paolo's referring to a project that, yes, exactly. So for a year in Rotterdam, a company did something that they called the quantified workplace experiment. I was very fortunate to be the social scientist who got to speak to the workers who were involved with it. Now, what the workers were given were Fitbits, rescue time, which sits on your computer, and just you can tailor it to kind of like, that's not the one. There's like a first one. That's a good one as well. There you go. This is, if you scroll back up a bit, just the very first one, which outlines. You can hardly see them, but here is a list of the types of things. So the project. So what I'll talk about right now, and then in a second, a couple of other things. Is the project with a group of workers in Rotterdam at a company that normally does real estate. So it was an interesting one. So essentially we're talking about professionals. So workplace tracking has a history in warehouse work, in factory work. So scientific management really relied on the way that technology could capture every single aspect of your productivity. So the quantification of work is what I'm looking at. And I think in the platform economy, for example, in the on-demand economy, in professional working places as well as factories, we're seeing that in fact management, if there is even still a category that can be called that, is investigating, is very much experimenting and looking for ways to use new types of technologies to continue to have supposedly productive, supposedly profitable work design models. So with the workers I've been interviewing over the course of a year, funded by British Academy and Leverhulme, there were 20 in the end who involved themselves in the project. So they were given the Fitbits, as I say. They were given rescue time on your computer, which allows you to find out, for example, how much screen time you spend. So there are ways of understanding productivity. I don't know about you if you think communications is productive or not, but rescue time doesn't necessarily think that. So communications, i.e. the time you spend on your email, Okay, so that one. Also, you do a daily life log, which means that every day you're given a kind of a record scale to estimate your subjective productivity, and then also your subjective stress. Now, it's very difficult for the sensory technology devices that I'm writing about to necessarily detect those kinds of emotions and stress, but there are ways of doing it with a dashboard. Now, the dashboard is where you can kind of where the aggregate data over a period of time, big data, can be understood and can kind of be compared by kind of transposing the different visualizations that are available. So it's the data itself that makes this the most exciting kind of story. But why did the company set out to do it? Well, the idea was that if workers are happier and they have a bit of well-being, and they came up with the metrics for how that can be identified, the kind of deciding factors, then are they more productive? Now, we've had productivity tracking software, but how do you convince knowledge workers to be tracked? That's the question. Right, so there are different ways of doing it. What my research shows, and I do talk about class, frankly, is that wellness initiatives are the way that the kind of supposedly non-working class, although working class simply means that you need a wage to survive. But professional workers, how do you convince them that it's okay for these things to be placed on your body and to start to investigate, again, even potentially the affective realm, the emotional dimensions of work, all these kinds of things. And how can you compact that? How can the employer look at that and say, this is the most productive, this is the exact work design model that allows me to use the tracking technologies. So that's it. And I've just finished a project with the International Labour Organization, which will be published by their journal, which actually outlines the types of stress that working with the new technologies reveal. So work intensification, new forms of surveillance is this kind of, there's something called the pinology, the types of surveillance that is usually used in policing contexts, whereby is there possibilities for workers to have new categories. You're seen as the one that we have to watch because you're in a new category of possible risk. And why is that? So how are decisions going to be made? And also what happens when the data that's produced is used in your appraisal? And what starts to happen when the health bar is raised? Because you have some employees who are able to, or worker, depending on your classification, which of course in demand economy you're not necessarily, but when that healthier worker is seen as, in fact, the right one. Okay, those are the kinds of questions that my research looks at.
And I guess that these tendencies are not just seen in this specific company that you analyze, but are now seen in many different companies. Amazon tracks workers, I guess. Yeah. Also, workers who are working in supermarkets with electronic cashiers are tracked, the number of operations they do, right? So it would also be good to hear a bit about the more general trend, how this prefigures a more general trend in the digital economy.
Absolutely. In fact, I brought a couple of statistics in terms of where investment is happening. A recent report shows that market for enterprise wearable devices is growing from $21 million 2013, predicted to be $9.2 billion 2020. Compound annual growth rate 138%. From 2014 to 19, more than 13 million wearable fitness tracking devices. So again, there's that fitness dimension will be incorporated into workplaces. Now, of course, if you can prove you're using these in countries where there's no health service, you can use this to reduce your insurance premiums. Your company will love you. For example, if you work for Whole Foods or is it Good Foods, one of these, if you can prove you've lost weight, you get a discount on food. Bit of a paradox. Anyway, the forecast for worldwide wearables to be shipped in 2019 forecasted to reach $126.1 million US dollars. And in 2015, nearly 1/5, okay, so that's 18%, and growing, of employees in Europe had access to wearable technologies at work. Now, the way that I look at this quantified workplace environment is kind of almost like a world of athletes. There's a term which is physiolytics, which is used so for high-performance athletes. Of course, the point is that it's competitive. So when you bring that kind of the individualizing dimension into a workplace where people are meant to be working together, again, what does that mean? That kind of question is what I'm asking.
And I guess also companies like Deliveroo and Uber use apps to track workers and what they're doing, the areas where they go. And in a way, something I was wondering the other day is whether the data is going to be used at some point to substitute Uber drivers with self-driving cars. So in a way, whether workers are preparing their own undoing by the fact that they're being tracked.
Well, I think this is one of the questions that's also being asked about self-driving cars, is that at the moment, taxis can be tracked, so that's absolutely fine. But again, it's the accountability question, but it also has to do with how can we claim back from insurance if there's an accident. So for me, accountability is key. Because at the moment, we kind of have the types of relationships between the employer, the employee, the worker, the client. We have the doctor, we have the patient, we have the teacher, we have the student. All those, this is the social change, a moment of social change, where all those relationships are potentially thrown up into the air. Because data itself can be used also as a defense. If you think about it, you can tell your employer, supposedly an employer, if that even will still exist, how much time you've spent, rescue time, for example, in front of your computer. You can say whether you've worked overtime, right? You can also use the data to say, oh, well, or you can say, oh, well, look, you can tell Uber, look, I've driven these many hours. Here's the, here are many clients I've picked up, and so on. But the way that I've looked at in terms of Uber workers, Deliveroo, and these kinds of platform work in the report/article, which also looks at trade union responses, which is going to be published by the ILO, has to do, for example, with the kind of insecurity that comes about when you don't have security, for example, of a pension, you don't have, necessarily health insurance in the countries where this doesn't exist. So if you don't have basic worker rights, and that's one of the big questions for me, and this comes up in all sorts of kind of aspects of the type of work, new world of work that we're talking about, does it matter that we can't rely on kind of the old models? And these are questions that need to be asked.
Great. So now I'm turning to Alex, and what I would like to ask you, Alex, is, in this world of increasing precarization of working conditions, in this world of hyper-exploitation of labor, as Nick was putting it, where, the gig economy really means a kind of 0 hours contract economy, where you can just be made to work whenever the algorithm thinks that you should work, and where basically all the rights that we inherited from the pact between labor and capital, the post-war settlement, are in question. What are the policies the progressive policies that should be developed in order to respond to these conditions?
Okay, yeah, this is a very important question. I think we've seen some recent successes in the UK relating to both Deliveroo and to the employment status of Uber drivers. In both cases, the magic ingredient was union organisation, effectively. So it's quite a boring answer, but it's this does seem to be able to generate some good results. I think, what needs to be done, at least initially, is we need to see a far more significant unionisation amongst these workers. And this might have to be led by non-standard unions, because existing unions, with a few exceptions, have barely caught up to post-Fordism, let alone the kind of like the platform economy. This might involve unions being creative, so both boring and interesting. I think in the longer run, how do we regulate platforms? I think when it comes to platforms that are acting as intermediaries for workers, I think that there's some basic that would be relatively simple to legislate for. I think what's more worrying is kind of platforms more broadly, where fundamentally what is it that what's the ultimate effect of their particular way of doing business? It's to achieve monopolies. They are natural monopolies. They basically operate through, as Nick kind of referred to, network effects. So when you're building a platform, and it used to be that platforms emerged and people didn't realise that they built a platform. So the history of kind of platforms goes back far beyond the kind of sharing economy, quote unquote, platforms of today. And at least in the kind of the way that business studies experts think about how do you strategize to build a business that has these effects. It goes back to companies like Microsoft, basically. These were some of the earliest companies that did this, and they did this explicitly. They set up in the 1990s a platform strategy group to achieve platformization. And basically, in this case it was kind of software, but you can think about this in other spaces. The idea is to end up in a monopolistic position by hitting a tipping point beyond which you just have, there are costs to not using a given service or platform. So there is an inherent drive towards monopolization. These are natural monopolies. Another way of thinking about it is simply that these are new forms of infrastructure. So just as socialists today would identify, for example, in the UK, especially the railways, for example, something that we realise must be taken into public ownership because they're a natural monopoly. You can only have one company running an individual train line, and therefore the tendency is towards them jacking up the prices and having a certain control over the kind of commercial dynamics of that enterprise. The same is true with platforms. They all operate when they get to the kind of the scale that they want to operate at. They operate as infrastructure, which is naturally monopolistic. So what are the policies? How can we respond to this? Well, I mean, you can look at the kind of policies that we've used to respond to previous kinds of monopolies. Antitrust legislation, monopolies and mergers legislation, all this kind of stuff. But these have become historically weakened throughout the kind of period of neoliberalism. So these have been watered down quite a bit, although you will see the EU, for all of its problems, striking back at various intervals at some of these large monopolistic platforms, most famously Microsoft, Google, as well as in their sites. I imagine that Uber will be following in short order. But I think there are broader problems, and the broadest problem is the fact that these platforms, when they're at their kind of most successful, are not just national monopolies. They're not just like rail companies that operate in a particular area within a particular country. They're completely global. Ideally, they would be universal infrastructure. And this does create some severe problems when it comes to thinking about how any group of individual states could legislate against them effectively.
And the other question that I often think about is how work is changing in this situation. I mean, we already saw in Phoebe's presentation how the workplace is becoming a place of surveillance in which workers are under the constant watch of managers. But it's also, in a way, it's also interesting how labor is becoming so fragmented, so instantaneous. I mean, the very idea of gig economy, right? The fact that you don't have anymore a certain fixed working time, and we haven't had that for a long time now. You know, people working during weekends by checking their emails, for example. But now it goes even farther than that. You know? And to the point also that also as the consumers you're working in a way, right? That when you're booking a cab, when you are going to the supermarket and checking out by yourself. Right? So I mean, in the book you wrote with Nick, you are trying to think about the future in which automation has an emancipatory potential and can allow us to move in a world beyond work, right? But there are also kind of contradictory developments there, whereby it seems as if work is multiplying, right? And is increasing more and more, partly as an effect of automation. What do you think about that?
I mean, I think this is right. Not necessarily maybe automation, but maybe the kind of the ability of platforms to, predominantly software-based platforms to operate as intermediaries, which enable an acceleration of already existing tendencies, which were kind of already underway due to the kind of post-warization of particularly Western developed economies. These obviously enable this to fragment even further potentially because of the particular kind of affordances of these technologies. I think when it comes to thinking about what could the potential upside of this be, because it does seem incredibly gloomy and doomy, and I think in this case we need to think about, and again I think it might be I might have to be quite gloomy here, because when we think about automation, we're thinking about, well, who are the companies that are going to be operating this? How are they going to be operating their services? Again, they're going to be operating as quasi-monopolistic platforms. So there'll be maybe one, maybe two, but probably just one big player in each space. So it will be within the kind of self-driving automotive space, or it will be within the particularly in terms of something like the public sector. So already you're seeing Google DeepMind, who are collaborating with the NHS, for example, and they're working on kind of big data analysis of healthcare data. And you can see that these, eventually these companies won't just work for the public sector, they will potentially be the public sector. So again, this gives rise to a need to think about how we're going to actually operationalize against this. And I think it is going to necessarily involve kind of international collaboration and the use of state funding. So I think if one of the problems with platform cooperatives is just the scale question, you want these things to operate at national or international scale, where's the money going to come from? And venture capital is not going to want to invest in non-profit making, or at least potentially profit-making entities.
Brilliant. Right. The last to speak before we open up to Q&A is Zina. So Zina, what do you think about this? I mean, I ask you to kind of provide a general response, some reflections about the debate.
Yeah. I think there's so much to say. I think that if we're looking for alternatives, alternative ways that we might organize our labor, our relationship to work, there, as you'll know, the universal basic income proposals that are out there. There have been some pilot studies. The recent one just happened a few months ago in Finland, and we have these paradoxes that arise from this seemingly progressive experiment, right? The idea is we all get a universal basic income, and it sounds pretty progressive, right? We're then somehow liberated from the demands of wage labor. What ends up happening, though, is that these policies they end up reinforcing the mantras of neoliberal capitalism, right? They're excuses for governments to cut the social safety net. So you're stuck in this bind between something seemingly progressive and something that's actually quite demonic. I think, interestingly, we think about let's say the sharing economy, collaborative consumption, the gig economy. We think about these as terms of a technological future, right? We think of these technologies as advances, whether for good or for ill, but we think of them in the context of a future. And I think actually what we're seeing is a reproduction of the past, and it's a reproduction of the very worst of the past, before organized labor, before the advances of labor unions, before worker rights were guaranteed. So while we think of these, again, as technologies of the future, I think they're quite the opposite.
There are some people who are saying that we are going back to the 19th century. Morozov goes as far as saying that we are going to feudalism.
Yeah. I mean, he likes to go to the far end, but yeah, I think that's not an illegitimate argument. At the same time, what's also quite interesting is we often think of these platforms as connecting people, right? It's you and your Uber driver, or you and the host at the Airbnb flat you're staying in. And this sort of magically hides the role of these huge corporations, these monopolies, these not just the platforms as big companies, but also these huge venture capital behemoths that fund them, right? Sequoia, Benchmark, Google X, Google Ventures. So somehow there's some sort of rhetorical magic going on here, where we forget that this is big business. This isn't about liberating the individual.
Brilliant. Great. So I think we have 25 minutes to go. We are planning to finish at 8 o'clock. So I think we will open it up to the public for Q&A. We'll take 3 questions at a time. You can direct your questions to a specific speaker or directly to the collective intelligence.
Hello. Hi. Thank you to the speakers. I actually work for Deliveroo, and I'm actually the chair of our union branch. So I appreciate the guy on the panel who says we need more union organisation. It's very hard work to try and organise people who are so individualised. I think that the thing that people kind of were leaving out is the question of political power alongside of it, because there was kind of a discussion about that, maybe we can build these alternatives, but ultimately, as we can see in the past couple of days, what the state will do to people that stand in the way of their financial interests, it will do anything to facilitate that going ahead. So I think any discussion about what we do going forward has to be a discussion about how do we build political power against that. And I just wanted to make a shout out. The Deliveroo union campaign has a public meeting coming up on the 8th of November at Marchmont Street Community Centre at 7 p.m. You're all more than welcome to come along. Big things are going to be happening in the next couple of weeks. We want to burst that bubble of the tech startups as well.
question up there. Yep. One there. Then the set.
Who's going first?
You can go first.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the speakers again. Really great hearing all these interesting insights. I'm very interested into how we can move from hell to heaven. So how can we use...
You like my Dante's metaphor. Yeah.
it's a great... So how can we blaze the trail or lay the path for this transition? Meaning, how do we use the technology, the platform technology, in order to empower a new economy based on cooperativism? And the question, just to put out the pitch, which is going to be explored at the Open Platform Cooperative event 16 and 17 February at Goldsmith. There are 4 or 5 outdated flyers up here if anyone's interested. And I am curious to hear your strategic insights on this question, how this might happen.
Brilliant. Thanks. Mercedes?
Yeah, I continue there a little bit. I find it quite interesting that we talk about technology and platforms as if they were the other, and we're sitting here asked to tweet, using platforms, we're sitting here in front of our Apple computers, and we're living this sort of paradox. It is as if we talk about a vampire system that we study while we're all using it, and I wonder what we think it needs for us to understand technology in a different way, because I have the feeling the way we speak about it adds to us shying away from it instead of opening up and using it in a different way. And I think we don't talk, and I know you both do that in your book, talk a bit more about how can we build other technology. So I would go to the Goldsmith event. And I ask this because I'm really worried that at the moment only capital seems to have an idea what it wants from technology, while we don't really have an idea yet.
Brilliant. All right. So let's now for the first round. You can engage in the order, speak in order we used before.
Sure. Yes. Okay. So congrats on the Deliveroo strike and the successes there. I think it's absolutely a fantastic model that other people should be replicating as well. It's something to learn from both existing trade unions and sort of new unions that are being organized. I think the question of political power goes to the heart of all of these sorts of questions. So not just how do we take down the sort of power of existing platform capitalists, but also how do we build our own technologies? And this is essentially the million-dollar question. I don't think there's any easy answer to it. I think it has to be a combination of both sort of bottom-up approaches with these sorts of spontaneous trade union organizing going on, but also assistance from the state. I don't think that platform cooperatives, for the reasons I gave earlier, are sufficient on their own. But we can sort of imagine something where Airbnb is heavily regulated, Uber is heavily regulated, to the point where actually a platform cooperative stands a chance. The other sort of aspect is, well, funding for these sorts of things. Corbyn, in his digital democracy policy proposals, has basically said, I want to give funding to platform cooperatives. Well, I think that's a fantastic idea because this is one of the sort of initial stumbling blocks. How do you get resources? So sort of bringing together the power of the state and the power of bottom-up organizing is necessary, even if that's quite general, but it's the only way forward, I see.
Thank you very much for your questions. I think there are some kind of themes that come out from the questions, and I think so. It's as though you guys were tweeting each other and planning it. So basically, excellent stuff. And I think it shows the kind of interest in what's next. So we're in the industry 4.0, which means technology and humans. We're not talking about something that we're going to necessarily revolutionize. Am I right? So what we're talking about is working together with machines, right? So how can we do that? What are trade unions going to do about it? Because trade unions have historically a model that has the ability to pose labor against capital in a different way. During manufacturing, if you stop working, you shut the machine down. Now we're talking about service economies. We're talking about different forms whereby it isn't so clear if you stop, that the machine stops, right? That's the tricky one. So there are a whole range of creative things happening. What I am doing with the Global Union is in the paper that I referred to earlier for the International Labour Organization, is we've done a kind of a study, a kind of a report on where trade unions have been successful so far, and at least kind of countering some of the worst effects of what we've been talking about. And that has to do with coming up with kinds of codes of conduct that companies should be following. So again, ILO is a tripartite model. So that's the company, the employer, and the employee or worker, management of worker, which of course there are fundamental tensions in the tripartism that are entailed there. So how to overcome that? Are we going to really get rid of capitalism? I don't know. Okay, so but the fact that we can all ask these questions, that you're doing that here, means there are possibilities. So I used to work on peer-to-peer production. Mayo Fuster mentioned that earlier. That's where I first came across her. I was very convinced a few years ago that those are the kinds of things that we need to be doing and make a commitment to do. The problem with those kinds of models is that it leaves out a whole bunch of people because of social reproduction, for example. Is this, who can actually be involved given the limits of the possible? Now, that's not necessarily to say that they won't work, and I think it's very encouraging to see that people are still trying to do that. But that's it. It's about taking time that's unpaid labor to talk to each other and try to make those things happen. Can trade unions do anything about it? There are different new models of unionism that are being discussed. But just to give you just a positive note, just to finish, on where there have been sort of successes. The Comrie law in France, for example, so you're not allowed to do work emailing on the weekends. Your boss is not allowed to email you. We've had success in Brussels, a bit in Germany. And it has to do with the conversations, the kind of actual going and speaking to the government, the Employers Association, and coming up with, right now, possible ways of countering the worst effects of what we're talking about. And it's openness, consent, consultation, private spaces, and proportionality. I've just given it away, even though it's not published yet. If you want to read it, just let me know. Okay, but yeah, those are the kinds of things that can be done. Oh, sorry, that's ours.
Yeah, I mean, the previous two speakers covered a lot of what, I think are the positive steps that we should be taking.
We're going to have the other order.
Okay, we're going to do the other order. I mean, I think I'll take the last question. So this technology, it seems like it's the other, it's a vampire system. How can we understand it? It's a good point. And what do we want from tech? And we need to ask this question. I mean, this is something that Nick and I in our work have asked, not just about technology, but about politics generally. Knowing what we want or might begin to work towards is a good first step, or a step that needs to be part of the process, and the left has become quite bad at working that out. It's often become very kind of negatively defined. So I think when it comes to something like technology, we need to realise that partly why these systems work, why we're tweeting, is partly because, they are a system of, partially a system of exploitation and a system of constraint that kind of sculpts our behaviour, but they are also to some extent enabling. Otherwise we would not use them. There has to be some upside, and there is upside, always. And it's this kind of dialectic of enablement and constraint that is part of the core of how platforms work, basically. So what do we want from tech? Well, I think what's important here is, so we're talking about unionising workers, but I think we also need to think about who are the people that are actually creating this technology. Well, it's partly business people, it's partly the venture capitalists, it's also coders. And an interesting project will be to at the moment, a lot of people that work in technology have a kind of implicit ideology which is not necessarily that progressive. But there are lots of people that work in technology who do have more progressive kind of inclinations, whether implicitly or explicitly. And I think it's important to connect them up with the people that are working at state or union level to begin to think about, well, how can we actually start working on technology which is going to embed different political priorities, in a sense.
And so I'll also start with that last question about the vampire other. I think that if we're trying to take power back, right, if we're trying to sort of reclaim our own agency as users, as citizens, we do need to acknowledge, as you say, Alex, that these technologies don't have to be the way that they are, right? People are in charge of making design decisions, other decisions about how our relationship is organized, how the affordances are designed, what affordances are inbuilt. So I think at a certain point, it's about just questioning the status quo and taking that power back from this idea that these technologies have to be the way they are. They don't have to be the way they are. We don't have to use Twitter while we're at an event, these are choices that we make. Regarding what we can do to make things better, so I think the panel has touched on this. So we have, of course, union organization, but we also have regulation. We've been living in this sort of hellish world of neoliberal deregulation of technology as a libertarian technology, right? Technology as a libertarian good that sort of does away with the need for the state. Well, we need the state. The state clearly has a role to play here in protecting workers' rights. It doesn't mean that the state is somehow anti-profit, right? It's not that those two are somehow incompatible. But as we saw in that Victory Friday for Uber drivers, the state does have a role to play.
Great. So the last round of questions. Hands up. Was somebody over there as well before? Yeah. You're over there? Right. And then,
So we have talked about opening up possibilities. So do you think this is a chance for developing a narrative for a new use of technologies and developing a new imaginary for the possible ways that we can develop this software or hardware into it? So maybe we need to believe in that.
Over there. Then maybe this DC image.
Hi, I just wanted to ask a question a little bit more about how we think these apps, particularly around dating apps, have an effect on human relationships, for example. Because I know this time we talked about Uber and Deliveroo and service exchange, but I'm just wondering if people have looked into the impact it has on our interactions with one another.
And yes, yeah. Apparently they have very good algorithms to predict voters' intentions.
They did. Yeah. All right. I think there was somebody there. That can be the last question. All right. Sorry. So that's the last question, I'm afraid.
The panel seems to be touching on the state's role, the state's positive role in this as a kind of facilitating role or throwing money at the right kind of people. I was just wondering if panel thought that it would be feasible or efficient for the state to have a role in research and development of these sort of technologies as a kind of something today, kind of why the TFL isn't letting it, if we can see that as a public good, it seems to be obvious.
All right. Zina, you want to start the round?
Sure. Certainly, the state has a role to play in R&D. Unfortunately, the Brexit decision means that we're potentially facing a real drought in funding that we used to get for research. But that's a bigger issue. The question of how these technologies affect human relationships, there's a lot of research out there about this. And a lot of it looks at the experience of the worker, the rise of precarity, the sense of just constant stress, of uncertainty, right? Not knowing how you're going to pay the bills at the end of the month. There's been some work done by Juliet Shore, who interviewed people who let out their rooms or apartments on Airbnb. And she found that these people came to resent having friends or family members visiting them because they viewed that as lost income, right? So, yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So state's positive role, feasibility for being involved in research and development. I mean, if you look at the kind of work of people like the economist Mariana Mazzucato, who I mention in every talk, with incredibly dull repetition because her work is just so essential. I mean, she basically says it depends what you mean by an innovation. So she pulls apart the iPhone and basically says if you look at the kind of 8 fundamental key innovations, so things like, for example, a touch screen, the internet, and further stuff, it was all basically funded by the state, often the American bodies that were associated with the American military-industrial complex and associated spin-offs. So, I mean, basically, core research and development is just always funded by the state, firstly. But then I think your question was slightly more interesting, which was why didn't TfL invent Uber, in a certain sense? Why is it that the kind of these kind of commercial applications, the kinds that we see in platforms, why aren't they run by the state? I mean, I think they certainly could. I mean, there's a question mark over whether Uber would actually be a valuable thing to create, or if it's just a kind of regulatory arbitrage operation backed by massive venture capital. But yes, similar kinds of things, I agree, would be good for the state to back. And I think this is something where this would be difficult, but potentially is going to be on the agenda in a way that it wasn't before. There was another question about do we need new narratives about how we can use new technologies, and maybe less kind of dispiriting monodimensional ones where it's all about the fact that these platforms are sort of coldly intermediate all our relationships and exploit us and send us back to the 19th century or even before that. You're absolutely correct. We totally do need new narratives, and we need to, I think, in connection with the second question about, or maybe the third question, about, is there a kind of digital divide in terms of knowledge levels, and does this kind of the exclusion from that drive various kind of reactionary decisions that people have made in terms of things like Brexit? I think that's absolutely correct. I think we need to teach people how to become empowered and how to build potentially future platforms that achieve that end. I think that would be important.
Well, thank you very much. So I just wanted to quickly kind of address the big elephant in the room, which is automation. And a recent World Bank report has shown that the countries at the highest risk for automation are Ethiopia and Thailand. Okay, so here we are whinging. We're 35% in Britain, right? These countries are 90-something, so on. And so what we're talking about is pretty much a Western issue right now, the kind of white working class, whatever. I mean, white working class or white collar, however you want to look at it. But anyway, in terms of the race to keep our jobs, it is quite sort of shared across countries. So maybe it's something that can be talked about as something international. Again, if we are talking about workers and workers' rights, there's an international dimension to this in terms of unionizing. I am working with the Global Union Confederation to look at the affiliates in different countries and the pressures that workers are facing. So it's about that communication, which itself can be facilitated also by tech, so that's very good. Okay, so then I think one of the questions that you're asking us is who can stop the robots? Because we are in a race to keep our jobs, let's face it. Will it be the state, or can it be ourselves, or could it be other robots? One of the things that you can rely on is that robots are not going to unionize, okay? So they're going to start doing your jobs. They don't sleep. They don't get sick. I mean, you have to set it up. You have to make an investment at the beginning, right? But again, are we in direct competition, or can we work with them? This is the big question, I think, at the moment. In terms of whether or not tech should be regulated, I think I've just answered my own question. But governments don't really like to regulate something unless if the risk is to kind of counteract innovation. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. The technology speeds ahead against our own kind of regulation and against what could be seen as workers' rights. And frankly, my research shows consumers right now have more rights than workers. Okay, I think that's all I had to say, really, and I hope I answered your questions.
So I'll just pick up on the digital divide question, which I think you're absolutely right. There is sort of this risk of two groups of people, one who understands the technology and the others who don't. And you can sort of see it in a couple different ways. One is, actually, there's certain sort of low-level AIs that we're developing that even the people who design them don't really understand how they operate. And there's sort of this problem where we may have decisions being made on the basis of an algorithm that the people who created the algorithm don't even understand why it's producing that output. So that becomes really sort of politically problematic. The other sort of aspect is, though, you can imagine a sort of algorithm making decisions through government or in the workplace, and as the user or as the worker, you're just provided with the decision on a computer screen, and it just seems to you as though it's this neutral, objective process which is telling you the decision that has been made. And I think at that point, the risk becomes that the revolt becomes against the technology rather than the capitalist social relations which are producing it. And I think actually a lot of criticism of technology today tends to be a sublimated critique of capitalism. And I think that we have to be wary of just projecting all our concerns about society onto these physical objects when actually it's something much deeper, which is the problem here.
Great. I'd like to ask many more questions to the speakers, and I'd like to debate these until midnight or later on, but unfortunately we don't have time to do that. I mean, at this point in the evening I usually say, let's go upstairs and drink some free wine provided by King's College London. Unfortunately, I cannot say this tonight because we had a network outage in the last week, and apparently that prevented us from booking a room to offer you wine, which tells you that automation sometimes is definitely a good thing, and automation. So instead of inviting you to free wine, I can invite you, those of you who want to come to a pub called the Wellington Pub on the Strand. It's not free beer, you need to pay it yourself, or with Bitcoin or whatever you prefer. And that's where we are heading now, whoever wants to join us. We are more than the pub can possibly fit, but hopefully there'll be a selection on the road. Thanks very much for joining us tonight, and we're looking forward to seeing you at other events.